Okay, we are going to move to our first segment here. This is part 2 of our interview with Paul Vallas. This runs around 31 minutes, and then I will be back with you. It kind of starts abruptly, but I'm sure you can handle it. Once again, if you want part 1, it's on our YouTube and YouTube channel, Facebook. It's up on Twitch right now still. So you can find it. I think it's still up on Twitter, actually. So you can find it in any of those places. Questions, comments about any part of the show, drop it in the comments or chat section. And I get it all here on my little screen, and I will respond. So I will see you after the interview is over.
I said the other day that really the police should be marching with the progressives should be marching with the police, because to a certain extent, everybody is kind of getting, let's say, kicked in the butt, so to speak. Yes. To use a milder term. I wanted to use a more aggressive term.
No, the same thing. It's the same thing Daley and them. There isn't much change. It's the same thing Daley did and Ron did. It's more spin, right? Like Lightfoot changed one funding program from 1 million to 33 million.
Oh my God,
right?
Yeah.
And it's like, all right, well, that's wonderful. That's 33 more pennies out of your pocket than there was. Wait a minute, 33 million isn't solving what's going on the South and West sides. I'm sorry. It just isn't going to, it's a drop in the bucket of what needs to be done in these communities.
Well, what I did during the campaign, you have to understand, I'm not doing this because I'm planning on running against stuff like that. I'm a policy freak. Yeah, I always have been. And I've been doing this since I worked for Don Clark Netsch in the 1980s and Phil Rock in the state legislature. And those are things that's why I went to New Orleans. That's why I did work for the Justice Department and Sally Yates, and the Bureau of Indian Education on revamping education on the Indian reservation. So I've always been, so I'm talking about these things because I want to say there are clear policy avenues out there. This is not beyond the city's means. The problem is if you don't do these things, the city's going to continue to deteriorate and the financial situations are going to be worse. Because the only way you're going to revitalize and grow the city is if you revitalize and grow the South and West sides. And there's an avenue to do this. Let me just, I think it's actually easier for the city to get out of its problems financially than it is the state. I think the state, even despite the fact that I'm always overly optimistic on ability to tackle these financial issues, the state finances are almost beyond the point of no return. But for the city's got $3.6 billion in what I would call virtually it's discretionary money from COVID. 1.8 billion for the schools, 1.8 billion for the city. And then you got $1 billion in TIF money that they're skimming off the top of property taxpayers. The mayor almost controls almost all that money, how it's spent. Then you got 1.7 billion in TIF balances. You're doing the math now. We're up at 2.7, 3.6, 6.3 billion. And then you've got the capacity to actually issue bonds, amortize the interest, and raise billions more off future property tax revenues that will be freed up when existing TIFs retire. So there is the means to make the type of investments that are going to get at the underlying causes of violence in these communities, begin to revitalize these communities. And as these communities revitalize, the tax revenue, fees, income will grow. The growth will fuel future financial stability and prosperity, you see? So they have the means to do it. The problem is, number one, they lack the vision. And even if they had the vision, I am really afraid that they lack the skills. And I'm going to continue to post and make suggestions and like you, offer our opinions, and hopefully some of it will take.
Well, I'm not sure who's going to be still around in a year or two in the Lightfoot administration, to be honest with you. But lack the vision, no doubt. And we have seen, I don't know what's different in policing in the justice system and in these communities from the last 2 administrations. We're spending all the TIF money in the loop and on the South and the West loop and the South loop in Fulton Market. That hasn't changed. She's just gotten access to more TIF money. That's the only thing that's really changed. And we're still with the overtime. I don't understand. I for the life of me, I don't understand. Like, I understood, like, when the when the unrest happened and you're like, sorry guys, you have to go 12 hours a day, vacations are canceled. The stuff is getting real. We have to do this. You always knew this was in the back of your head, this could be a possibility. But once that settled down, why we're still in 2021 using massive overtime in the police department befuddles me. I don't see how it's effective. And I think originally Rahm, when it happened to Rahm, he had that one warm winter, McCarthy's first winter. He had a warm winter and violence surged.
Right.
He's like, we're going to go to overtime because all the experts, and I was one of them, and it did, said that crime was going to start going down again because we had an unusually warm winter, and it started ticking down. But they kept but they just kept ticking away at this overtime. I don't understand it. For Rahm, at that one point, it made sense because, hey, 1 year of overtime, let's not hire 1,000 or 2,000 more cops. This is going to settle down just naturally. And it did. But he kept the overtime up. McCarthy did. Now Brown is doing, Eddie Johnson did. Now Brown's doing it. I don't see any difference between the three of them.
Well, the problem is it's not filling vacancies combined with a failed strategy that's forcing them to do overtime. Because with these two super units and dragging so many officers, and they're paying the officers to work overtime downtown and stripping the districts of local beat cops, when there are flare-ups, as naturally happens, and you've seen flare-ups everywhere in the city now. You know what I mean? You know, Beverly, for example, the shooting at the restaurant in broad daylight. I mean, bottom line is when you have that failed strategy, you have to rob from Peter to pay Paul, to dispatch officers to the latest hotspots, to sit in cars, which is not a solution. And that's not a strategy. So it's not only the failure to fill vacancies, but of equal, if not greater importance, it's the ineffective strategy that's driving up the overtime costs. When I was budget director, the most I ever paid for overtime in a single year was $35 million. And in today's dollars, that's maybe 53 million. And what will they pay in overtime this year? 250 million. I mean, it's just ridiculous. So any amount of savings by not filling vacancies is being eaten up by overtime, and all you're getting is tired cops. You know,
right. And if you can't, and if you can't do it, if you're up to that 13,700, and first again, do the study. Let's know how many officers you really need. But if you can't do it with that many cops, then, and the study says you need more. This is one thing that separates me from the left. It's like, no, science rules. They'll either say you need more cops or they'll say you need less cops. Right. My thinking about why the FOP doesn't want the study done is they're worried it'll say they need less. Right. And I think the police department to some extent is they're worried it's going to say they need more. So neither one's going to do the study. But how our mayor interviewed Brown, looked at his history and said, here's the innovative thinker that we need in Chicago, really befuddles me. And I didn't know anything about Brown. And as soon as I heard he was coming, I looked at stories in the Dallas Morning News and I started calling journalists. Yeah. And they're like, here is his playbook. Here's where you're going to get. He's going to manipulate data. He's going to lie to the media every day. He's going to complain about the media every day. He's going to complain about guns every day. He's going to do this thing where he takes detectives off of cars and puts them in cars with their lights on in these areas. And I'm like, he ain't going to do that. She's like, oh yeah. One of them was like, oh no, 100% that's coming to Chicago. And here we are. It's here.
If they wanted to, look, they could have, first of all, effective policing has to be built around community policing. And I'm not using it in a generic way. Community policing for me means beat cops, means cops on the beat, cops that the community is familiar with, constantly interacting with the community. There's a police presence there. There's a known police presence. And, not only did they strip the districts of their police, of their beat cops, too many of them, but they also shut down the area support teams. And those area support teams, which provided backup to the districts, focused on three things: guns, drugs, and gangs. Or maybe it was gangs, drugs, and guns in that order. But the bottom line is that's what they're focused on. And so you've got to build your police strategy around this concept of beat integrity. You don't need a mobile 1,000 officer force to kind of move in mass like an occupying army from one area of the city to another. I mean, you could have easily created a special service unit of 300 officers that would be specifically dedicated toward going into those hotspots, and then have a system in place where other officers, when they have additional time off and things like that, could participate. But then they could be trained to deal with crowd control. They could be trained to deal with to go into the high crime areas. I mean, they could be special events. You all remember how McCarthy, look, McCarthy gutted the police department. More importantly, did serious damage to the detectives division. The number of detectives went from 1,200 to 800, which was just crazy. But one of the things that he did very effectively was he had this very well-trained unit to manage the NATO summit, if you remember, when they had that. And they did it well. And I mean, you could have easily had that done. But this, I mean, it's a combination of Brown and his first deputy not being ready for prime time, and the mayor's office trying to micromanage and that, like, not filling cop vacancies and having the terrible strategy. That's a dangerous combination. And incompetent leadership at the police department matched by ineffective micromanagement from City Hall.
Right. Brown, in my opinion, Brown earned his firing on the first weekend of the George Floyd protests. Him and the entire administration of the police not seeing, like the intelligence units, I think, saw it to some extent, but not seeing the protests coming and the wave that was coming in Chicago when the state police did and the Cook County sheriffs did, and everyone, all the major departments around the city saw it coming and they didn't, was enough to be, we have the wrong man in here. But
then they had the second meltdown in August, you remember?
Yeah. Well,
I mean, it was like, what?
Yeah, and honestly, you want to be honest, I'll tell you honestly, Mayor, now whether you're for or against defunding the police, there were calls from the street for that. Mayor Lightfoot made a tragic mistake not coming out and saying, listen, especially after being head of the Police Accountability Task Force and having this big reputation as a police reformer. Listen, I don't know if I'm exactly for it. I don't know what that phrase means, but I think it's time we start a conversation about what other responses we should build up.
Right, I agree.
And possibly take calls, and I have the calls for service data, and we're going to produce a report on it. We can take away from the police and build up mental health and all these other things. So let's get off the street and come into the conversation. We're going to start a 2-year conversation around the city. We're going to go virtual until the pandemic's over, and then we'll go into each community, and we're going to have these discussions. And right as soon as that first set of protests hit and the first set of unrest, and kind of took the wind out of people, because, you know, Martin Luther King says riots and unrest are the voice of the unheard, right? And what Lightfoot did is when that voice came up, she spit on him by saying, absolutely not. I will not even entertain it. There's absolutely nothing. There's no discussion to be had. No, that was a mistake. You should have tried to bring those people, the people you need to pull away by engaging them. And then you're going to be left with people that, to some extent, are not worried about being engaged, and then you have to deal with them with how you have to deal with them. But she should have taken the wind out of that immediately and said, yes, we're going to talk about it. Look at what happened to George Floyd. Look what happened to this guy. Look what happened to this guy. Look, Quan McDonald. We're going to have that conversation. Instead of being, one of her weaknesses and strengths is she's very intelligent, but she also thinks she can make a decision in a snap. And that was, to me, a fatal decision that she did that.
Well, you know, look, she doesn't like criticism. The 2 Aprils ago, when I cautiously came out and I said, I don't think the city has a contingency plan financial contingency plan for the impact of COVID, or maybe I said in May. I mean, I got blasted. He's just a publicity seeker or whatever, blah, blah, blah. And I was actually providing some constructive suggestions and recommendations. Of course, 3 months later, the city was in crisis, you know, so at the end of the day, I just think that she, who knows, she's thin-skinned. She doesn't want to, she recoils at criticism rather than looking at it and rather than co-opting it constructively. Yep. So much of what I've posted have been obvious things for the mayor to do. I mean, look, the city needs a witness protection program. There's no, if they wanted to improve the homicide clearance rates, they could do what other cities have done. They could go out and they could bring back retired police officers, detectives, and police officers with investigatory experience to help the police officers, the detectives, work cases, to do all the things that the detectives have to do, like going out and, taking the witnesses to and from court and doing all the administrative things that take them away from actually working cases. I mean, there's a lot of things that could be done. These are no-brainers. Take these ideas, co-opt them, call them your own, repackage them, whatever you want to do. But she just bristles. Look, the city council wants to have a hearing on violent crime, and it's part of the Burke conspiracy. I mean, you know what I mean? Look, anyone who criticizes her as a racist, and the council exhibiting a pulse is what did you call him? Burger King Ed. Yep. I mean, she throws out names like Trump, for crying out loud. You know what I mean?
Right. And
when you listen about it,
there is so much blame to go on for the city council on top of it. And so,
no doubt.
Right. And now, I have big issues with the Black Caucus, probably big issues if I look closely at the Latino caucus, for their inaction, fighting Daley and fighting Rahm, and just saying yes to everything as long as they get reelected. And Lightfoot, unfortunately, has found herself in a position, because she didn't do too bad under COVID, but she couldn't manage everything else. And now she's in a position where she's weak. So now city council members have all of a sudden found a pulse, because they don't fear the mayor as much as they used to fear Rahm. And by the way, they don't want to do the legislating. Many of them are there just to collect the check and work another job and take the privileges. So the city council is as much to blame, if not more, for the situation we are in. They sold the meters, and we can go on and on and on with all the disasters the city council members have done.
You got a 50-person city council, which is a huge city council, and more democracy is better than less democracy anytime. But that's technically, it's a strong city council, weak mayor format, but it's not like that, because the city council has abdicated their responsibilities. And the reasons that you articulated. These are plum jobs. They're part-time jobs. You have to get full-time salaries. They get all these benefits. They get these really lucrative housing, office allowances. They have staff. They can work other jobs at the same time. They're like, I joke that they're like the lords in the movie, the nobles in the movie Braveheart. Yes, you know what I mean? And they're like Longshanks, and they may know better than to sell their allegiance to the mayor or to the king, so to speak. But they do anyway, because they're just thinking. I mean, for many of the aldermen, this is it. This is top. They'll never be in a better position. Yep. I mean, that's why the mayor doesn't get a lot of challenges from the city council when it comes to mayoral elections, because they don't want to risk giving up what those plum jobs are. Right. And then I'll tell you, you mentioned about your concern about the Black Caucus and the failings of the Black Caucus. I actually feel really very sorry for the Black Caucus, because they don't have the independence that maybe a Riley or a Hopkins has, because they don't have the capacity to. First of all, they're heavily dependent on the mayor and how she allocates this TIF money, this little booty of financial booty or bounty or bountiful, or whatever the right terminology is, that they have. This pot of gold that they have, where she can simply has broad discretion on how she allocates the money, and they don't have the ability to really have the type of fundraisers where they can raise money independent of the special interest. So you've got like the Chicago Teachers Union. I remember when the majority of the aldermen voted to support the union, saying schools need to be closed until they can be kept safe. So I went to the forums and I looked at the campaign contributions that the union and their allies had made to these aldermen who voted in favor of it. Was $2.2 million. A Hopkins or a Riley, they can have a fundraiser, and all those companies, they come in, those businesses, they have fundraisers, they raise a lot of money, but the aldermen, they become almost prisoners of the special interests. So it's hard for them, because they don't have that financial independence. They're dependent on the mayor, and they're dependent on a handful of special interests, sometimes one or two, like Chicago Teachers Union. And that, I think, is the reason why they tread so lightly. They're not as aggressive as they could be. So it's circumstances. And I'm trying to be sympathetic here.
No, I agree. And I'm less sympathetic, but you are, I think generally you're right because, and I had Fioretti of all people we have massive disagreements now, but he told me a similar thing. He's like, they can't raise money. He
Right.
goes,
Yep.
why do aldermen on the south and west sides, unfortunately, why do they seem so, or seem at least statistically more often to get busted for stupid things, right? Like Ike Carruthers. He got, instead of going to jail for work on his ward office like his dad did, he went to work on his house. Why? Because they can't raise money,
Yeah.
right?
Or somebody raises money, or somebody takes payoffs and then use the money to buy turkeys on. It doesn't matter. They took the $5,000. Oh my
Right.
God, talking about low hanging fruit. And for the longest time, that's who the feds would go after, that low hanging fruit.
Right, right, because it's hard to get Burke. Burke is a lawyer and he's got 10 lawyers. So why did they get him? They got him towards the end, probably end of his life. Let's be honest. Eddie's old,
and
right?
because he got careless.
Right.
Because he got careless.
Right. And that's when you get the Ed Burks, because he's got 10 lawyers and he's a smart lawyer. Remember another Fioretti story. Burke, when Fioretti got elected the first time, Burke was like, all right, you're going to send me all your zoning, right? And in City Hall, and Fioretti's like, he goes, don't worry, it's perfectly legal. Don't worry about it. You're fine. We've researched it all. Right. But that's how that runs for rich, well-to-do, connected, other job white aldermen who have second jobs and are like Fioretti was a lawyer too. He did his lawyers. He was a lawyer while he was running for alderman. And that's how things differ. You don't go on the west side and see a ton of black aldermen or Latino aldermen that have both the aldermanic gig and some high-paying corporate gig also. Yeah. Right.
That's right. This is their gig. This is it.
Right. So
this is it. You know,
another reason why we need public funding of elections. If we had public funding of elections in Chicago, that would eliminate that. Oh, mayor, please give me 50 grand, or please don't pick on me and I might lose my seat. I've got just as much money as anyone to fight for the seat.
Look, you know, one of the things that I did that is now considered to be infamous back in 1990, 1995 when I became city budget director, because the Daley had actually had his previous budget rejected. So I came in, I became city budget director, and they used to really play the spoils games where if you were an opponent, and the mayor had a large opposition in those days, you just didn't get anything when it came to allocating money for street repairs, things like that. So I said, look, I'm going to take every budget is going to have an agenda, and we're going to have a list of things that we're going to make available to every ward, no matter whether they're, at the time they actually had one or two Republicans, you know, but whether you're part of the Harold Washington, remnants of the Harold Washington caucus, so to speak, or whatever, you're going to get the same amount of funding and to allocate so that the aldermen didn't have to beg or cut deals or give the mayor their vote, you know, and it created more unity and less dissent than anything. But the idea was to get at the fact that there are many poor areas in the city, and you really have to guarantee them a fair share of the resources, even if you have to institutionalize it. And one of the things that I did during the campaign was I talked about a couple of things. I talked about, what if we took all the TIF money, all the both the current and future TIF monies, and the casino money. I had a different plan for cannabis. And what if we said a third of all that money is going to be black box? That includes the developer fee money and stuff. Yeah. And that money was going to be used exclusively on the south and west sides to invest in the south and west sides. It would be lockbox. So if you got $1 billion in TIF money a year, eventually 300 million of that would go to the south and west side. If you got the casino money, it would go to the south and west side. I mean, what if you did that? What if you structured it that way? And I just don't see any of that thing happen. Look at what we did with the cannabis. We blew it. The cannabis industry, it's a killer industry. I had said that if you're going to legalize cannabis, the city should literally take ownership of the dispensaries like Pennsylvania does with the liquor stores. Pennsylvania owns the liquor stores and then they lease the liquor stores. And I said, let the city only open community owned, which the city would have an equity investment in, dispensaries run, owned, operated by the communities to sell marijuana. In fact, better yet, let's create a urban agricultural economy. Let's grow the marijuana the vertical farming and the, you
Yep.
know, yeah, let's do that here. And then let's tell the state that half the money generated has to go back to where that has to go back to the counties and municipalities. So what happens? They turn around, they legalize marijuana. Find me, I mean, is there a dispensary owned where someone who's Black or Latino is majority owner? Maybe there is now because they've been getting some heat. But I mean, where's the community ownership? Where's the local ownership? The cities only get 8% of the money that's being generated. Only 8% of the money is going to cities, and they can levy like I think it's a 3% tax. We squandered it. You know, I had said, let's use the money, let's take control of that industry, and let's spend all the money, all that tax money from cannabis on funding community-based social service infrastructure. Let's use it to fund the job training, fund the opioid addiction, centers. Let's fund the family counseling centers, et cetera, et cetera. Not family planning, I'm talking about family counseling. The intervention, let's use it to fund the mental health centers. And they squandered it. And they're going to do that with the casinos too.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt. It's a city tradition.
That's right.
Right. They can always find money to pay. Be honest, they can always find money to pay rich white people to give them handouts to build stadiums over by merchandise. No, over by the convention center, or they can pay $100 million to fund Marriott's hotel over there. But they can seem never, that was wrong. They can never seem to find money on the south and west sides. And I tell people all the time, first of all, when they come to Chicago, I said, if you want to see real Chicago, get outside the potted plants.
Yeah.
The north side's pretty. Let me take you on the south and west side tour, and you'll see what like 2/3 of the city actually looks like. And the other thing I tell them is, look at all those cranes up there. All the cranes you see, we paid a percentage of each one of those probably.
Yeah.
TIF money. And I think TIFs should be either completely eliminated, but if we're not going to do that, make every person that gets funding through the TIF program, all the developers, right? All of those people, you have to give us, you have to have 95% employed people by Chicago. Mm-hmm. What? No. My cousin, I love him to death. He's retired now. He's a carpenter. I'm sure he worked on TIF products. He lived in Schaumburg, Palatine. He lived at Palatine. Him and his guys would come in every day to the city. It's like, wait a minute. Why? If we're going to spend Chicago money, they ought to employ Chicagoans.
When we did our, it ended up being a $3.2 billion school construction program. We built 76 new schools and renovated over 600 in 6 years. And incidentally, I took all the projects out of the Public Building Commission where the contracts were handed out to the friends of the mayor, people at clout, so that we could openly bid it. And at the time, when we took over the schools in 95, no one expected the schools were going to become a positive in those days. So they didn't really have a capital program. We created it. So we had control over it, at least for a while. And, but we basically said over 50% of the contract have to go to Black or Latino businesses, women-owned, and half of those working had to be Black or Latino or women, and half of those hired had to be local residents. And at the end of 6 years, 76 schools later, 350 major renovations later, over 3,000 minor renovations. And we built Northside College Prep, Peyton, Gwendolyn Brooks, and Roseland, my community. You go through the school, the Westinghouse, we built all those schools. When we were done, 54% of the contract work had gone to Black and Latino and women-owned businesses, and 58% of those hired were minorities, and 52% were city residents. Well, the city controls, that's just one capital plan. Yep. The city controls $24 billion in spending every year, not counting all the capital. $8 billion in construction at O'Hare, right? The O'Hare improvements, so O'Hare expansion renovation that they're doing out there. I mean, if the city did target marketing, we did a lot of target marketing where we target specific only, like, for example, small technology contracts. We only awarded to Black businesses, small Black businesses. So schools that had contracts under, like, I think it was $10,000, $15,000. They heard, you should have seen the growth in businesses. So we did target marketing with demolition and hauling and things like that. So we did a lot of target marketing. We hired, Daley wanted to privatize. He was in a privatization kick. It was the great privatization. He privatized, privatized, privatized. He wanted to privatize everything. So I resisted that, and he wanted to privatize custodial services and the engineering services in the schools because he had done it in the city. And I said, no, I don't want to do that. So we struck a compromise. I would only privatize the new schools we built, not the old schools. So yeah, we privatized new schools. We only hired minority companies to do the custodial work. So we hired minority companies, 4 Black, 2 Latino companies, or was it 3 Black, 2 Latino, 1 woman-owned company. And they got to work to do the new schools. You can easily do that. The city, it's $24 billion, not counting billions in additional capital money. You can do a lot of economic development just by the way you prioritize the awarding of those contracts, just by opening up the procurement process, just by making it easier for minority companies to bid. We insured all the construction companies, so minority companies that didn't have the experience to enable them to get a bond to do the big projects, but they had the expertise to do it, could get to work. So we brought that insurance in-house. So there's things you can do, and they're not doing it. And they, number one, they don't know how to do it. Number two, even if they did, or number one, they don't know what to do. And in some cases, there are certain individuals, including people in the mayor's office, including the mayor, who are just, they're too arrogant to accept advice from somebody else. Who's going to remember what it is, where the advice is coming from? It's the outcome that matters. If you're the mayor, ultimately you're going to get credit for it. And so they either don't know what to do or refuse to take ideas that they come from somewhere else, or they don't know how to do it. And that's really, it's tragic for a city because we're at the crossroads here.
All right. Paul, thank you so much for jumping on with us. We went way longer than I originally wanted to.
30 minutes. The overtime. Just joking.
So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Have a great day. Stay safe.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, we are back. So it's always an interesting discussion when Paul comes on. We don't always agree about a lot of things. I disagree with a fair amount of his Facebook posts. I think the solutions that a lot of people like Paul and others push to crime and violence are just way too simplified. I agree that I made clear I am not a Superintendent David Brown fan. I wasn't a fan of his selection in the beginning. I did the research in Dallas about his time in Dallas to know what was coming. Lies, scarecrow policing, manipulation of data, this idea of sticking detectives in cars with their lights on. No. That's all crapola. Knew it was coming. We have to deal, I think Paul and I agree that we have to deal with, you can't move a city forward without agreeing the tax increment financing program.